Airline staff ignore a black woman's requests. Minutes later, she's their new boss and fires them. What happens when those in power think they're untouchable, when they assume their actions go unnoticed and their behavior unchecked? This is the story of a woman who quietly observed, waited for the right moment, and turned the tables in a way no one saw coming. An ordinary morning at the airport became a lesson in respect, justice, and leadership. You won't believe what unfolded when the truth was finally revealed. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The hum of chatter filled the terminal as Sarah Miller stood patiently in the first-class check-in line. Her suitcase rested by her side, its sleek leather exterior bearing subtle scuffs from years of travel. She glanced at her watch, noting the time. It was still early, but delays always had a way of cascading. The line moved slowly, each passenger greeted with polite efficiency by the airline staff. Sarah adjusted her blazer, its tailored cut hinting at her quiet elegance. Her expression was calm, composed. Years of navigating boardrooms and negotiations had taught her the value of patience. Yet, she couldn't ignore the slight tension in her shoulders as she observed the counter staff. Laura Wilson, the supervisor, stood out immediately. Her sharp features were framed by a rigidly styled bob, and her clipped tone carried over the din of the terminal. Next, Laura barked, barely glancing at the passengers before gesturing them forward. Beside her, Peter Jones leaned casually against the counter, exchanging smirks with Laura whenever something or someone caught their attention. As Sarah approached the counter, she caught the faint flicker of Laura's gaze sliding over her, accompanied by a subtle narrowing of her eyes. Laura turned to Peter, muttering something that drew a chuckle from him. Sarah chose to ignore it. She had learned long ago not to let assumptions cloud her focus. Finally, it was her turn. Sarah stepped forward, her stride steady. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm but firm. "I'd like some assistance with my flight. There seems to be a delay, and I wanted to check on." Laura held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Your ticket, please," she said curtly, her tone devoid of any of the cordiality she had extended to the previous passengers. Sarah handed over her boarding pass without hesitation. Laura scanned it quickly, her lips curling into a faint sneer. "This is a first-class ticket," she remarked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes," Sarah replied evenly, keeping her gaze steady. "That's correct." Laura exchanged a glance with Peter, who snickered audibly. "You sure you're in the right line?" Peter asked, his tone feigning politeness but failing to mask his derision. He gestured vaguely toward the economy check-in area. "Maybe over there?" Sarah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She inhaled deeply, reminding herself to maintain her composure. "I'm in the correct line," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "If you could check on the delay." Laura interrupted again, her tone sharp. "You'll need to wait. We're busy right now." Sarah blinked momentarily, stunned by the blatant dismissal. "I've been waiting," she said, her tone still measured but firmer now. "I'd appreciate it if you could address my request." Laura let out a dramatic sigh, making a show of her supposed exasperation. "You'll have to wait longer," she said, turning her attention to the next passenger. Next, Peter, meanwhile, leaned closer to Laura, his voice loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Entitled much?" he muttered, chuckling. Sarah stood there for a moment, her calm exterior masking the storm brewing within. She watched as Laura and Peter carried on as if she didn't exist, their demeanor shifting entirely when addressing the next passenger, a man in a sharp suit. The contrast was stark. She stepped aside, not because she intended to leave, but to reassess the situation. Her eyes swept over the counter staff, noting every detail. Their expressions, their body language, the quiet complicity of the other employees who glanced her way but quickly looked away. A younger staff member, a woman with nervous eyes, hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. She met Sarah's gaze briefly, her expression tinged with regret, but she said nothing. Sarah gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that she had noticed. This wasn't the first time Sarah had been underestimated, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But the blatant nature of the behavior, the mockery, the dismissal, was something she couldn't ignore. She had hoped for better, but now she knew exactly what she was dealing with. Straightening her shoulders, Sarah moved to a nearby bench, her mind working through the possibilities. She wouldn't let this moment pass without consequence, but she also wouldn't allow herself to be baited into anger. She had a job to do, and this, she realized, was part of it. As she sat, observing the staff and the passengers who filtered through the line, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had been treated this way, how many had walked away humiliated and frustrated without the power to address it. Sarah glanced at her boarding pass, the first-class designation printed clearly on the card. She traced the letters lightly with her fingers, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they would. Sarah remained seated on the bench, her posture immaculate despite the slight ache from her prolonged wait. The terminal around her was alive with movement, passengers wheeling luggage, families saying hurried goodbyes, and announcements echoing intermittently over the intercom. Yet, Sarah's attention stayed fixed on the check-in counter. She watched as Laura continued her routine, her interactions alternating between saccharine smiles for certain passengers and curt efficiency for others. A few times, Sarah noticed Laura's gaze flicker her way, her expression tight with annoyance. It was clear that Laura wasn't used to being challenged or questioned, even subtly. Peter, on the other hand, was entirely oblivious to the mounting tension. He leaned against the counter lazily, chuckling at his own quips and occasionally nudging Laura with his elbow. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes scanning the dynamics of the staff. The young woman who had hesitated earlier was now assisting another passenger, her hands trembling slightly as she typed on the keyboard. Sarah noted the subtle but telling glance the woman threw in Laura's direction, as though seeking approval or perhaps fearing reprimand. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at the counter. A middle-aged man in a rumpled business suit was gesturing animatedly, his voice rising above the ambient noise. "I've been waiting for 20 minutes, and you're telling me my seat is gone? How is that even possible?" he demanded, his face reddening. Laura's response was practiced but icy. "Sir, as I've already explained, we're dealing with overbooked flights. There's nothing I can do. You'll need to wait for the next available flight." Her tone carried a hint of condescension, as though she were addressing a child throwing a tantrum. The man muttered something under his breath and stormed off, leaving Laura to roll her eyes dramatically. "Some people just don't understand how airlines work," she said, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Peter chuckled in agreement, shaking his head. Sarah took a deep breath, suppressing the growing frustration within her. She had dealt with individuals like Laura and Peter before, people who mistook their positions of limited authority for absolute power. But what troubled her more was the silence of the other staff members. They weren't complicit, not exactly, but their inaction spoke volumes. A subtle vibration in her blazer pocket drew Sarah's attention. She retrieved her phone, glancing at the screen. A message from her assistant, Jasmine, appeared, "All set for your arrival. Mr. Harris is excited to introduce you to the team." Sarah's lips curled into a small smile. She quickly typed a response. "I'm seeing the team in action already. It's enlightening. We'll update you soon." Sliding the phone back into her pocket, Sarah stood and smoothed her blazer. She returned to the counter, her steps measured and deliberate. Laura noticed her approaching and immediately stiffened, her jaw tightening as though bracing for another unwelcome encounter. "Yes," Laura said, her tone clipped. "What now?" "I'd like to confirm the status of my flight," Sarah said, her voice calm yet firm. "I've been patient, but I need clarity." Laura sighed dramatically, as though the request was an unbearable imposition. "Like I told you before, you'll just have to wait. We're very busy." "Busy ignoring paying customers?" Sarah's question was soft, almost conversational, but it carried a weight that made Laura falter for a split second. Peter's smirk faltered too, though he quickly masked it with a derisive chuckle. Laura recovered quickly, narrowing her eyes. "Listen, ma'am, if you're going to be difficult, I can call security to handle this." Sarah raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Security? For asking about my flight status? That seems excessive." Laura didn't reply immediately. Instead, she turned to Peter and muttered something under her breath, which made him chuckle again. Sarah watched them carefully, noting every detail. The slight flush creeping up Laura's neck, the nervous glance Peter threw toward the growing line of passengers. The young staff member from earlier, now stationed at a nearby desk, glanced over hesitantly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but quickly closed it when Laura shot her a warning look. The girl returned to her task, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Sarah sighed inwardly. It wasn't just about Laura and Peter. It was about a culture that allowed this behavior to persist. Her role wasn't just to identify problems, but to address their root causes. This wasn't just about her experience. It was about the countless passengers who had likely endured similar treatment. Very well, Sarah said finally, her voice steady. If you can't assist me, I'll wait. Laura's triumphant smirk was short-lived as Sarah added, but I'd recommend you reconsider your approach. You never know who might be watching. Laura scoffed, clearly unfazed. I don't need a lecture, ma'am. Have a seat and wait like everyone else. Sarah offered her a polite smile, stepping aside to allow the next passenger forward. As she moved back to her bench, she could feel the eyes of other passengers on her. Some offered sympathetic glances, while others looked away, unwilling to get involved. Sitting down, Sarah reached for her phone again. She opened the Notes app, typing quickly. Observations, dismissive attitude, lack of accountability, passive complicity among junior staff, immediate focus, address systemic behavior, develop training protocols emphasizing empathy and professionalism. She paused, her fingers hovering over the screen. Her gaze drifted back to the counter, where Laura and Peter continued their routine, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. A small, determined smile formed on Sarah's lips. They had no idea what was coming, but soon, they would. Sarah remained on the bench, her posture poised as if she were attending a board meeting instead of waiting in a chaotic airport terminal. The bustling scene before her seemed both distant and immediate. Passengers rushing to their gates, luggage wheels clattering on the tiled floors, the rhythmic beeps of announcements punctuating the air. Yet, her focus remained sharp, her eyes fixed on the counter. Laura and Peter had fallen back into their rhythm of dismissiveness and mockery, their behavior largely unchecked by the other staff. Occasionally, Laura glanced in Sarah's direction, her eyes narrowing as if Sarah's presence alone were an affront. Peter, emboldened by Laura's demeanor, laughed louder now, his posture growing lazier by the minute. Sarah leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other, and studied them as one might study an intricate puzzle. The young staff member, the one who seemed uncomfortable earlier, caught her attention again. Her name tag read Emily. Sarah watched as Emily quietly handled a passenger's issue, her hands moving swiftly over the keyboard, her brow furrowed slightly. And though her voice was soft, her tone was polite and steady. The passenger, an older woman, smiled as Emily handed her a boarding pass. Thank you, dear, the woman said warmly. Emily returned the smile, but it was fleeting. As soon as the passenger walked away, Emily glanced nervously at Laura, who was too busy berating another traveler to notice. Sarah noted the tension in Emily's shoulders, the way she seemed to shrink slightly after every interaction. It was as if she carried the weight of the counter's hostility, even if she wasn't directly responsible for it. At the counter, a young man wearing a hoodie and carrying an oversized backpack stepped forward. Laura barely glanced at him before snapping, "You're in the wrong line. Economy is over there." The man hesitated, pulling out his phone to check his boarding pass. "No, I'm in first class," he said quietly, holding up his phone screen as proof. Laura's eyes darted to the screen, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Fine," she said curtly, waving him forward as if she were granting a favor. "But you should have known better." Peter smirked, muttering just loud enough for Laura to hear. Must have been a lottery win. Sarah's fingers curled slightly in her lap. The subtle but insidious nature of their comments was like a thread weaving through every interaction. Laura's hostility wasn't limited to her, and Peter's behavior was more than just unprofessional. It was corrosive. As the young man walked away, Sarah made a mental note. Every interaction added a piece to the larger picture she was building, a tapestry of dysfunction that went far beyond a single rude supervisor. Leaning forward, Sarah rested her elbows on her knees, her chin lightly touching her clasped hands. Her mind wandered briefly to the meeting she was scheduled to attend later that day. They'll be expecting introductions, pleasantries, she thought, her lips curling into a small, ironic smile. Instead, they're getting a live demonstration. She thought of the countless people who had likely endured this same treatment. Not everyone had the privilege of a first-class ticket or the composure to stand their ground. Many would have left the counter feeling humiliated, their voices dismissed before they could even speak. The thought tightened something in Sarah's chest, a familiar old ache. Her phone vibrated again, breaking her reverie. She glanced at the screen. Jasmine, ETA for the introduction? Mr. Harris wants to time the announcement. Sarah quickly typed a response. Soon. Gathering valuable intel. Sliding the phone back into her pocket, Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of quiet. She closed her eyes, letting the hum of the terminal wash over her. Her calm wasn't just for show. It was a tool, honed over years of navigating spaces where she wasn't expected or welcome. A sharp voice broke through her thoughts. I'm not dealing with this. Laura's exclamation turned heads, drawing the attention of passengers nearby. A middle-aged woman, clearly frazzled from travel, stood at the counter, holding a boarding pass. But my flight is in an hour, the woman said, her voice trembling. I just need. Laura cut her off with a dismissive wave. I said we're busy. If you can't follow instructions, that's your problem. The woman's face flushed, and she stepped aside, clutching her boarding pass tightly. Sarah watched as she retreated, her shoulders hunched in defeat. It was then that Sarah stood again. This time, her steps were slower, more deliberate. She didn't head directly to the counter. Instead, she approached Emily, who was nervously arranging papers at her station. Excuse me, Sarah said softly, her voice calm. Emily looked up, startled. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in Sarah's composed demeanor. Why yes. How can I help you? Sarah offered a small smile. I've noticed how attentive you've been with the passengers. It's rare to see someone so committed to good service in an environment like this. Emily blinked, clearly caught off guard by the compliment. Oh, thank you, she stammered, glancing quickly at Laura as though expecting a reprimand. You don't have to look over your shoulder, Sarah said gently. I'm simply acknowledging your professionalism. It doesn't go unnoticed. Emily nodded, her expression softening slightly. Thank you, she said again, her voice steadier now. Sarah returned to her seat, her presence still drawing occasional glances from Laura and Peter. They seemed unsettled now, though they hid it behind their usual bravado. Laura muttered something to Peter, who nodded in agreement, but neither approached her again. The clock above the terminal ticked steadily forward, each passing minute bringing Sarah closer to her moment of action. For now, she remained still, her thoughts sharp and focused. The staff didn't realize it yet, but the tides were about to turn. Sarah sat back on the bench, her posture still immaculate, a portrait of calm. But inside, her mind was a precise storm, analyzing every detail of the interaction she had observed. Each insult, each dismissal, and each complicit silence added fuel to the fire smoldering within her. Yet, she remained still, waiting. Timing was everything. Laura and Peter continued their routine, though there was a new edge to their movements. Their loud conversations were now tinged with tension. Laura glanced at Sarah more frequently, her gaze sharp and watchful, while Peter avoided looking at her altogether. It was clear that while they hadn't yet connected the dots, they sensed that something was off. Emily, meanwhile, worked quietly at her station, diligently assisting passengers without drawing unnecessary attention to herself. Sarah noticed how Emily's hands trembled slightly each time Laura passed by, and how her eyes flickered with unease when Laura barked orders or snapped at passengers. Despite the young woman's obvious nerves, she maintained a professional demeanor, her voice soft but steady as she assisted travelers. The terminal grew quieter as the morning rush began to wane. Sarah noticed an older couple approach the counter, their movements slow but deliberate. The husband leaned heavily on a cane, and the wife carried their boarding passes. Laura's expression shifted immediately, her features tightening as though the sight of the elderly pair was an inconvenience. We need assistance, the wife said, her voice trembling slightly. My husband has trouble standing for long periods. Is there a way we could? Laura cut her off with a curt wave of her hand. You'll have to wait like everyone else, she said dismissively. We're busy right now. The woman hesitated, glancing at her husband, who was visibly uncomfortable. But we just need a wheelchair or... Laura sighed dramatically, her patience clearly wearing thin. I already told you we're busy. If you can't wait, that's not my problem. Sarah felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she didn't move. Not yet. She watched as the couple exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of frustration and embarrassment. The wife opened her mouth to say something, but Laura had already turned away, pretending to busy herself with papers on the counter. Emily, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. She glanced at Laura, then at the couple, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak. But she stayed silent, her gaze dropping back to the desk in front of her. The wife gently guided her husband to a nearby chair, her shoulders sagging as she sat beside him. Sarah watched them for a moment, her heart heavy. This wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruelty. Sarah's thoughts drifted to her own parents, long gone now, but vividly alive in her memory. Her mother, with her gentle yet firm guidance, had always taught her to treat people with dignity, no matter the circumstances. Her father, a man of quiet strength, had lived by the mantra, "You can tell a lot about someone by how they treat those who can do nothing for them." She thought of how her parents would have been treated by someone like Laura. The image was enough to steel her resolve. Reaching for her phone, Sarah opened her notes app again, typing with deliberate precision, staff behavior assessment, systemic issues rooted in poor leadership, immediate priorities, address lack of empathy, ensure accountability, long-term goals, transform team culture through training, mentorship. She paused, her fingers hovering over the screen. Her gaze shifted back to the counter, where Laura and Peter were now laughing at a private joke, their voices carrying across the terminal. Actions speak louder than words, she whispered to herself, her tone steady. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention. A man in a sharp, navy suit, flanked by two assistants, entered the terminal with a purposeful stride. Sarah recognized him instantly, Mr. Harris, the regional manager who had orchestrated her hiring. His presence was commanding, his movements deliberate. Laura noticed him too, and her demeanor shifted immediately. Straightening her posture, she smoothed her uniform and put on a saccharine smile. Peter, less adept at masking his behavior, simply stood up straighter, his smirk replaced by a look of mild confusion. Mr. Harris, Laura called out, her tone suddenly warm and enthusiastic. What a surprise to see you here. Harris approached the counter, his expression unreadable. He nodded briefly at Laura before scanning the terminal. His eyes landed on Sarah, and for a moment, his composure softened. He gave her a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement that the moment they had planned for was near. Sarah rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. She adjusted her blazer, smoothing out invisible wrinkles, and began walking toward the counter. Each step was measured, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. Laura's smile faltered slightly as Sarah approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with irritation. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to Harris, her calm gaze meeting his. "I think it's time, don't you?" she said softly. Harris nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I agree." Laura's confusion deepened, her eyes darting between Sarah and Harris. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice losing its usual confidence. Sarah turned to face her fully, her expression composed but firm. "I'm Sarah Miller," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the surrounding chatter. "Your new regional director." Laura's mouth fell open, her face flushing with a mix of shock and panic. Peter's eyes widened, and he took an instinctive step back, as though trying to distance himself from the fallout. "I've spent the last hour observing your team," Sarah continued, her tone steady. "And what I've witnessed is unacceptable, both as a leader and as a human being." Laura stammered, I didn't know." "That much is clear," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. "But whether you knew or not doesn't change the fact that your behavior has been completely unprofessional. You've disrespected passengers, belittled your colleagues, and failed to uphold even the most basic standards of customer service." Laura's face paled, her bravado crumbling under the weight of Sarah's words. Peter looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely. Sarah stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about you," she said, her voice softening slightly. "It's about creating a culture where people feel respected and valued, whether they're passengers or employees." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, the terminal seemed to pause, the usual noise and movement fading into the background. The terminal's bustling energy seemed to still as Sarah Miller stood before the counter, her composed presence commanding attention. Laura Wilson, now visibly pale, struggled to recover her usual air of confidence. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Peter Jones, standing slightly behind Laura, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smugness replaced by an unmistakable unease. Passengers nearby, sensing the tension, slowed their movements, some stopping entirely to observe the unexpected confrontation. Even Emily, the young staff member, looked up from her desk, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and cautious hope. Sarah allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the counter staff. Then, her voice cut through the quiet like a blade, steady, clear, and unyielding. "What I've seen here today is not just a failure of customer service," she began, her words measured. "It's a failure of empathy, professionalism, and basic human decency." Laura's hands gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening. "Miss Miller. Director Miller. I didn't realize who you were," she stammered, her tone a mix of panic and desperation. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression cool. "And why should that matter?" she asked, her voice calm but pointed. "Would you have treated me differently if you had known? Is your respect reserved only for those you believe can hold you accountable?" Laura opened her mouth to respond, but Sarah held up a hand, silencing her. "This isn't about me," Sarah continued, her tone firm but not unkind. "It's about every passenger who has stood at this counter and been dismissed, humiliated, or ignored. It's about the culture you fostered, one where disrespect is tolerated and professionalism is an afterthought." Sarah reached into her blazer pocket and retrieved her phone. "I came here today as a passenger," she said, holding the phone in her hand. "But I also came as an observer, and I've been documenting everything." Laura's face drained of color, her earlier confidence shattered. Peter's eyes darted to the phone, his jaw tightening. Emily, on the other hand, straightened slightly, her expression a mix of surprise and quiet relief. "Your behavior," Sarah said, her gaze locking onto Laura, "has been nothing short of appalling. From dismissing passengers with legitimate concerns to mocking them openly, you've shown a complete lack of respect for the people you're supposed to serve." She turned to Peter, who flinched under her scrutiny. "And you," she said, her voice sharpening, "you've been complicit every step of the way. Your laughter, your comments, they're not just unprofessional, they're harmful." Peter stammered, I was just following Laura's lead. She's the supervisor." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "And that excuses your behavior?" she asked, her tone cutting. "You had a choice, Mr. Jones. You chose to perpetuate this toxic environment instead of standing against it." Sarah shifted her focus to Emily, her expression softening slightly. "And you," she said gently. "I've watched you today, and I see someone who wants to do the right thing but feels trapped." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. I didn't know what to do," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I was afraid of losing my job." Sarah nodded, her gaze steady. "I understand," she said softly. "But staying silent only allows this behavior to continue. Change starts with the courage to speak up." Turning back to Laura and Peter, Sarah straightened her shoulders, her tone regaining its firmness. "Effective immediately, both of you are suspended pending further investigation," she announced. Laura's mouth fell open, her earlier panic giving way to indignation. "You can't do this," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "I've been with this company for years. And that makes your behavior even more unacceptable," Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. "You should know better." Peter looked as though he wanted to argue but thought better of it, his face a mix of anger and resignation. "Security will escort you out," Sarah continued, gesturing to a nearby officer who had been observing the scene. "You'll have an opportunity to defend your actions during the formal review process. Until then, you are not to return to this terminal." The officer stepped forward, his expression neutral, as he motioned for Laura and Peter to follow him. Laura glared at Sarah, but there was no fight left in her. She turned on her heel and marched away, her movement stiff with suppressed rage. Peter followed, his head hanging low. As the two disappeared from sight, the tension in the terminal seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Sarah turned to the remaining staff, her expression firm but not unkind. "This is a turning point," she said, addressing the group. "We have the opportunity to rebuild this team, to create a culture of respect, professionalism, and empathy. But that requires all of you to take responsibility, not just for your actions, but for the environment you help create." Her gaze landed on Emily, who straightened under the weight of her attention. "You've shown great potential today," Sarah said, her voice warm. "I want to see you thrive in a workplace where you can be proud of what you do." Emily's eyes brightened, and she nodded, a small smile breaking through her earlier nervousness. "Thank you," she whispered. As the staff returned to their duties with renewed energy, Sarah stepped aside, allowing the next passenger to be served. She watched as Emily handled the interaction with grace, her confidence growing with every word. Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. This was only the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. She had come here as an observer, but she was leaving as a leader, determined to make a difference. As Laura and Peter disappeared from the terminal, escorted by the security officer, the tension that had gripped the space slowly began to ebb. But for Sarah, the work had only just begun. She stood for a moment near the counter, her gaze steady as she surveyed the remaining staff. Each of them appeared a mixture of relieved and uncertain, their postures more rigid than they had been earlier. It was clear that the events of the past few minutes had left a profound impression. Emily was the only one who seemed to draw strength from the shift in dynamics. Though her hands still trembled faintly as she typed on the computer, her shoulders no longer drooped, and her voice carried a new steadiness as she addressed the next passenger. Sarah took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had long learned the importance of balance, firmness where necessary, but empathy where it could affect lasting change. Moving deliberately, she stepped toward the counter where Emily stood, taking care not to disrupt the transaction she was handling. When the passenger walked away with a polite smile, Sarah leaned slightly toward Emily. "You did well just now," she said softly. Emily looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, thank you, Director Miller," she stammered, her cheeks flushing. "You can call me Sarah," she said, offering a small smile. "Titles are less important to me than actions." Emily nodded, clearly unsure how to respond. Sarah didn't push further. Instead, she turned her attention to the other staff members nearby, catching their uneasy glances. "May I have your attention, please?" Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. The remaining employees stopped what they were doing, their focus shifting fully to her. "This morning has been revealing," Sarah began, her tone measured. "I came here not to disrupt your work, but to understand it. What I've seen has highlighted both the challenges you face and the opportunities we have to improve, not just as individuals, but as a team." She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the terminal was thick, the weight of her presence palpable. "Let me be clear," Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping over them. "The behavior I observed from some members of this team is not only unacceptable, but completely incompatible with the values of this company. Disrespect, mockery, and apathy have no place here." The employees shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, while others kept their gazes lowered. "But," Sarah added, her voice softening slightly, "this isn't just about what went wrong. It's about what we can do to make it right. Each of you has a role to play in shaping this workplace into one that values respect, professionalism, and empathy. This is your opportunity to rise to the occasion." One of the senior staff members, a man named Gregory, hesitated before speaking. "Director Miller," he began, his voice cautious. "I think I speak for many of us when I say that we've been frustrated with how things have been. Laura, she had a way of making things difficult for everyone, not just the passengers." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate your honesty, Gregory," she said. "But let me ask you this. What stopped you from addressing it sooner?" Gregory looked uncomfortable, his gaze dropping momentarily. "It's hard to speak up when you don't feel like you'll be heard," he admitted. Laura was, well, she was close with some higher-ups, and it felt like pushing back would only make things worse. Sarah's gaze softened. "That's a valid concern," she said. "And it highlights something we need to address, not just here, but across the organization. A culture where people fear speaking up is a culture that fails everyone." She turned to the rest of the staff. "If you take nothing else away from today, let it be this. You will be heard. I'm here to ensure that, but I can't do it alone. I need each of you to be willing to step forward, to advocate for yourselves and for each other." As the employees nodded, Sarah noticed Emily lingering nearby, her hands fidgeting nervously. When the group dispersed to return to their tasks, Sarah approached her again. "Emily," she said gently, "may I have a word?" Emily nodded quickly, stepping aside to a quieter corner of the terminal. Her eyes darted nervously, as though still unsure of her place in the unfolding changes. "You handled yourself well today," Sarah said, "even when things were difficult." Emily looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to do more," she admitted, "but I was afraid." "That's understandable," Sarah said, her tone kind. "Fear can be paralyzing, especially in an environment like this. But the fact that you cared enough to try, that's what stands out to me." Emily looked up, her eyes meeting Sarah's. "Do you really think things can change here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah's gaze was steady. "I don't think change is possible. I know it is," she said. "But it starts with people like you, people who want to make a difference." Emily's lips curved into a small, hesitant smile. "I'll do my best," she said softly. "That's all I ask," Sarah replied, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the terminal began to shift. The remaining staff worked with a new sense of purpose, their interactions with passengers more focused and professional. Sarah watched from a distance, stepping in occasionally to offer guidance or address a concern. By the time her scheduled meeting with Mr. Harris arrived, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. There was still much work to be done, but the seeds of change had been planted. As she walked toward the conference room, Sarah glanced back at the counter. Emily was assisting a young family, her voice calm and reassuring as she explained their boarding process. The young woman caught Sarah's eye and offered a small wave. Sarah returned the gesture, her smile warm. The meeting room where Sarah was to convene with Mr. Harris was a sharp contrast to the busy terminal. Its frosted glass walls muted the distant hum of activity outside, creating a space that felt quiet yet charged with purpose. Sarah entered slowly, taking in the minimalistic decor, a sleek table, ergonomic chairs, and a large screen mounted on the wall, displaying the company logo. Mr. Harris was already seated, his posture upright but relaxed, exuding the calm confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes environments. He looked up as Sarah entered, a small, knowing smile forming on his face. "Sarah," he greeted, standing to shake her hand. "I've been looking forward to hearing your assessment, and I've been looking forward to sharing it," she replied, her tone even but warm. After exchanging brief pleasantries, Sarah took a seat across from Mr. Harris. Her demeanor remained composed, though her mind was sharp and focused. This was her opportunity to translate the morning's events into actionable insights. "Before we begin," Mr. Harris said, his expression serious but encouraging, "let me thank you for your approach today. I received preliminary reports about your presence in the terminal, and it seems you've already made quite an impact." Sarah inclined her head slightly. "I appreciate the acknowledgement," she said, "but the impact isn't mine alone. It's the result of the behaviors I observed, and the behaviors that must change." Mr. Harris nodded. "Let's hear it, then. Start from the beginning." Sarah began her debrief methodically, recounting the events of the morning in detail. She described the dismissive and unprofessional behavior of Laura and Peter, the fear and passivity among the rest of the staff, and the tangible effects this culture had on passengers. "The key issue," she said, her tone measured, "isn't just individual misconduct. It's a systemic problem, a culture that tolerates and even enables disrespect and apathy. Laura and Peter were symptoms, not the root cause." Mr. Harris leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled. "And the root cause, in your assessment?" Renee paused, choosing her words carefully. "A lack of accountability," she said finally. "When employees believe their actions won't have consequences, or that speaking up won't make a difference, standards erode. Over time, that becomes the norm." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's a hard truth to face," he admitted, "but necessary." Renee continued, outlining specific instances she had witnessed. Her observations were meticulous, her delivery precise. She also highlighted moments of potential, particularly Emily's quiet professionalism and willingness to learn. "There are employees here who want to do better," she said. "They just need the tools, the support, and the leadership to make it possible." With the problems clearly articulated, Renee shifted her focus to solutions. Her proposals were practical but ambitious, aimed at not just addressing the immediate issues, but fostering long-term change. "First," she began, "we need to implement a comprehensive training program. Not just technical skills, but soft skills, empathy, communication, conflict resolution. Every employee, from the newest hire to senior staff, should go through it. Mr. Harris nodded, jotting down notes on a tablet. Agreed. What else? Second, we need to establish a clear system of accountability, Renee continued. Employees must know that their actions have consequences, both positive and negative. That means regular performance reviews, anonymous feedback mechanisms, and visible enforcement of standards. Good, Mr. Harris said, his tone approving. And the third? Renee leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. Third, we need to empower employees to speak up. Fear thrives in silence, and silence allows misconduct to persist. We need to create an environment where people feel safe raising concerns, without fear of retaliation. Mr. Harris studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this, he said, and I can see why we brought you on board. Their conversation shifted to logistics, timelines, resources, and implementation strategies. Mr. Harris's questions were probing but collaborative, and Renee appreciated his willingness to engage deeply with her ideas. As they discussed, Renee's thoughts occasionally drifted back to the terminal. She pictured Emily, working diligently despite the challenges she faced. She thought of the passengers, the elderly couple, the young man in the hoodie, who had been mistreated but had no voice to address it. Her resolve deepened. This wasn't just about policies or procedures. It was about creating a space where dignity was the baseline, not the exception. Toward the end of the meeting, Mr. Harris leaned forward, his expression earnest. Renee, I have to ask, what was your impression of the staff overall? Do you think we have the right people in place to turn this around? Renee considered the question carefully. There's potential, she said finally, but potential needs nurturing. Laura and Peter were clearly obstacles, but others, like Emily, are diamonds in the rough. With the right guidance, I believe this team can thrive. Mr. Harris smiled faintly. I'm glad to hear that, and I trust you to lead the way. As the meeting concluded, Renee felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The path ahead would be challenging, but she knew she had the tools and the support to make a difference. Walking back into the terminal, she was greeted by a noticeable change in atmosphere. Emily smiled hesitantly as Renee passed, and other staff members straightened their postures, their movements more deliberate and focused. Renee paused near the counter, observing for a moment. When Emily glanced her way, Renee gave her a small nod of encouragement. The young woman's smile widened, her confidence growing before Renee's eyes. Taking a deep breath, Renee moved toward the exit. The sun had shifted higher in the sky, its rays streaming through the terminal's glass walls. It felt like a new beginning, not just for the team, but for the passengers who would walk through these doors in the days to come. As Sarah stepped out of the terminal into the crisp afternoon air, she paused for a moment, letting the events of the day settle in her mind. The sunlight glinted off the glass facade of the airport, casting long shadows that seemed symbolic of the work still ahead. Change wasn't a single action. It was a journey, one step at a time. Inside, the terminal continued to hum with activity. Sarah knew the environment was far from perfect, but something had shifted. The toxic dynamics that had poisoned the team for so long had been confronted, and in their place, seeds of growth had been planted. Emily, and others like her, now had a chance to thrive, and passengers could begin to expect a standard of dignity and care that had long been neglected. As she walked toward the parking area, Sarah reflected on the moments that had defined the day. Laura and Peter's downfall had been inevitable, but it was Emily's quiet courage that stuck with her the most. People like Emily were the heart of any organization, people who just needed the right conditions to flourish. She also thought of the passengers who had endured mistreatment. Their experiences were a reminder of why this work mattered. For every person who passed through those terminal doors, the smallest act of kindness or the briefest moment of dignity could make all the difference. Sarah unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, her mind already turning to the future. There was much to do, training programs to design, accountability structures to build, and trust to rebuild among the team. But she felt a quiet confidence. Today had proven that change was possible, even in the most entrenched environments. As she started the engine, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Mr. Harris. Great work today, Sarah. The board is already impressed. Looking forward to seeing what you accomplish next. Sarah smiled faintly, setting the phone aside. She appreciated the acknowledgement, but her focus remained on the work itself. It wasn't about impressing the board. It was about creating a legacy of respect and professionalism that would outlast her tenure. As she pulled out of the parking lot, the road stretched before her, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. It was a fitting metaphor for the path she was on, challenging, but full of promise. Sarah Miller wasn't just there to enforce policies or discipline wayward employees. She was there to lead, to inspire, and to remind everyone, staff and passengers alike, that they deserved better. It wouldn't happen overnight, but step by step, she would help the team find its way. And when she returned to that terminal in the weeks and months to come, Sarah hoped to see not just a change in the staff, but a change in the air itself, a shift from tension to trust, from indifference to care. It wasn't just about running an airline. It was about lifting everyone who walked through its doors. Smiling softly to herself, Sarah turned onto the highway, the horizon wide open before her. And so, what began as a day of mistreatment ended as a powerful lesson in accountability and respect. The actions of a few unraveled, and justice was served, proving that leadership isn't about titles, it's about values. If you found this story inspiring and want more like it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us share more impactful stories. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.